Hey, everybody. Good morning. It is so good to see you. Welcome to the official start of our 163rd academic year. It is good to see all of you. I hope you had a great summer. I had a wonderful summer. Basically spent my summer doing two big things. First is watching the Olympics. We basically had the Olympics on nonstop in our house, which led us to ask one big question. When did we as a country decide that Snoop Dogg is our national mascot? I have no clue, but I have to say I'm totally on board with it. The other thing that this constant Olympic exposure did for me is it inspired me to work on my own athletic abilities. And so I'm now announcing that I'm going to dedicate the next 4 years, 100% of my time, to training for the 2028 Olympics. My goal is to be the first Hope College president to win a gold medal. Honestly, I'm just trying to figure out which event I should do. So I've been practicing a bunch of different ones. Been doing a lot of beach volleyball recently. Here's a recent picture. Of course, I always do it in my suit, like I do everything. I've also been thinking a lot about breakdancing as a potential option. Here's me breakdancing the other day. I mean, it might look in this picture like I'm defying gravity. Somehow the jacket isn't even going. But that's just because I'm so good at breakdancing. Actually, somebody told me yesterday that they've already taken breakdancing out of the next Olympics, which actually that kind of makes sense. But it is a bummer for me because I've been practicing so hard. My daughter does gymnastics, so that's a good option for me. She's been teaching me how to do the balance beam. But I think to be honest, the one I'm really going to focus on is pole vaulting. This one feels like the best option for me. I mean, we are getting so good at Photoshop in the president's office. I think that might be my favorite Photoshop ever. The proportions are a little off. It kind of looks like, do you remember the movie Honey, I Shrunk the Kids? It kind of looks like that. Anyway, watching the Olympics was one big thing I did over the summer. The second big thing I did was just sit back and watch my kids grow. It is crazy. They get a little older and a little bigger every year. This morning was their first day of school. Maybe some of you had the same day that we did, where we're getting our kids off for school. Sophie is now a junior in high school. She's in 11th grade. Sophie is dual enrolled at Hope College this semester. So shout out to the incredible Dr. Stephanie Edwards, who will be her Calc 2 professor. So you may see Sophie on campus even more, that's the point. But be prepared because Sophie is really tall, at least tall by Scogin standards. Depending on how you measure it, Sophie is now taller than me. And when I say depending on how you measure it, what I mean is if you put her in a hole and measure it that way, then I'm still a little taller, so I feel good about that. Lucy, our middle daughter, started high school this morning, so she's in 9th grade. And my little man, Oliver, started middle school this morning, so he's in 6th grade. So we have no more kids in elementary school, which feels like a family milestone. I have to say, one of the real highlights of my summer was watching my son, Oliver. He was in one of the Hope Rep Theater productions this summer, an amazing musical called Big Fish. Thanks. A beautiful story about a father-son relationship, and the father is dying of cancer, and I lost my own father to cancer, and Oliver played the son, and it was just a really moving thing for me. I saw the musical 13 times. There were 15 performances, so I missed a couple of them, but saw most of them. It's a 2.5-hour production, so if you do that math, that's 85% of my summer right there. But it never got old. It really didn't. And speaking of not getting old, this time of year never gets old for me. It really doesn't. This is my 6th time through the start of an academic year as president, and I love this time of year. I look forward to it all year. I'm excited about our move-in day tomorrow. We have an amazing group of new students moving in tomorrow. We have about 860 new students. Most of them will be moving in tomorrow. That's 806 freshmen and about 50 students transferring into Hope from other colleges and universities. And we feel really good about those numbers. Those numbers are admittedly a bit shy of the goal we had, but given the FAFSA challenges that we had last year, we feel really, really good about those numbers. And the other thing that we feel great about is that we basically had no summer melt this year. So the number of freshmen has hovered right between 805 and 810 all summer. And it looks like we'll have 806 to start the year. So we feel really, really good about that. The other thing, to be honest, that I look forward to every year is this event. I love this event. I spend a lot of time thinking about what to say to you and how to frame our year, and I look forward to it. We call this the State of the College, and so I've got some thoughts that will take roughly 40 to 45 minutes or so, and then we're going to introduce our new colleagues who've joined us since the last time we did new colleague introductions in January, and all of that will take us through 11:15, 11:30, something like that. So that's our plan. This is the State of the College address, as you know, and the point of this address is to basically provide a status update on how we're doing as a college. Or in the words of our Gen Z students, the point is to spill the tea on how we're vibing. However, in recent years, I've actually chosen to do something a little different. At this event, rather than focus solely on our current state, I've used this speech to focus our attention toward the horizon, focusing on the big things that propel us into the future. And we've looked over the last few years at things like the Hope Forward initiative and the middle way concept. And last year, what we did is last year we focused on the crucial question of how are we actually going to achieve these things? And what we said, in no uncertain terms, is that our main tactic is to follow the wind of the Holy Spirit. As we gather today, I propose that we try and weave together all of these threads from the last few years. And what I'd like to do this morning is try to connect the big ideas that we've been talking about and present to you a potential overarching vision for Hope College, a vision that transcends individual projects and initiatives and goals. This is, I think, an opportune moment for doing so because one of the projects that we'll undertake this year as a campus community is the project of articulating our key institutional objectives following the sunset of our current strategic plan next summer. And while, of course, we already know the big things that we're working on, and those won't change, our accrediting body requires us to have a stated set of objectives. And so this exercise gives us the opportunity to stop and zoom out and ask the big question of, wait, where is it exactly that we're trying to go again, and why is that destination so important? That's the point of the whole strategic planning process that we'll undertake this year, and it matters because if we don't do this once in a while, we run the risk, in the words of the American proverb, of climbing to the top of the ladder only to realize it was leaning against the wrong tree. Or in the words of an ancient Jewish proverb, of gaining the whole world only to lose your soul. All that to say, before we can really assess the state of our college, we need a clear understanding of what the goals are. Otherwise, we can't have a meaningful discussion because we're talking about different things. I've asked Becky Schmidt, professor of kinesiology and our head volleyball coach, to lead this process for us. And over the course of the academic year, she'll be facilitating campus conversations about how we're going to articulate our institutional strategy and objectives. And there will be ample opportunity for everyone to give voice to these conversations. What I'd like to do this morning is start that conversation, and start that conversation by providing a framework for how, in my view, I think we can consider our overarching vision. And I want to look at this through a very specific lens. Because for us at Hope, it's never been quite as simple as deciding who we want to be. For us, there's an added layer of complexity because we aren't just a college, we're a Christian college. Christian college, it's two words, not just one. And so in practice, what happens is that we end up asking two questions. First, how are we doing at the college part? And second, how are we doing at the Christian part? And when I started this job, it didn't really bother me that we were assessing ourselves in these two separate ways. And actually, to be honest, the second goal was probably the one I was most passionate about. But the longer I've been in this position, the more this second goal, this question of how Christian are we, has actually started to bother me. And it's starting to bother me for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's just really vague. The goal itself is vague, and how we measure it is vague and arbitrary and artificial. How do we really know what our status is in this area? Is it by chapel attendance? Is it by the number of times we say the word Christian? Is it by the number of people who wear Christian t-shirts or listen to Christian music? It's just never been clear to me. And the second reason this goal bothers me is that at times it feels like an add-on, like we are trying to do two things at once. And it often feels like we're being graded for doing two separate things: become the best college we can be and make sure that we stay Christian. Imagine that you're a student again, and every time you write a paper, every time you turn in a paper, your paper is graded in two separate categories. How good is the paper overall? And two, how Christian is it? Or imagine that every answer you give on a math test or a science test was assessed in two ways. How correct is your answer? And two, how Christian is it? It's weird. It's weird, and yet at times it feels like that's how we're being graded as a college. Now, I realize that a lot of thought has been given to this over centuries, and a lot of ink has been spilled on this problem. Most Christian colleges have had conversations that span decades about the integration of faith and learning and how those two fit together. And I do have to say that of all those conversations, I'm particularly impressed with the contributions that have come from our own college. We at Hope have historically done a great job of articulating how we can be excellently academic and faithfully Christian at the same time. But nevertheless, I've noticed that the question keeps coming up, and it continues to feel like a source of tension. And I'm wondering if the reason that the answer never really sticks is because the definition of the Christian part keeps changing. The truth is that the word Christian means different things to different people. It means different things in different times and places, in different traditions, in different denominations, and in different historical contexts. In contrast, think about how much consensus there is about what counts as academic excellence and how little that changes over time. Sure, there are debates, and sure, it changes, but for the most part, we all agree. What I'm saying is, being a college isn't necessarily the complicated part. It's being a Christian college that gets confusing because the word Christian means different things to different people, and that makes it hard to win. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? Well, over time, other Christian colleges have all pretty much decided to do the same thing. Almost without fail, every Christian college has eventually decided to let go of the Christian part and focus solely on the college part. In 1994, George Marsden wrote a book called The Soul of the American University. And in the book, he meticulously lays out the reality that to date, no college has maintained a Christian identity for more than 200 years. So the three schools that he examines most closely are Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And each of those schools transitioned to secularism at roughly the 200 mark in their history. And if you look at the colleges in the United States today who hold a strong Christian identity, none of them are older than 200 years. In other words, it's too early to tell if anyone will be the exception. To be fair, there are a few schools who are drawing near to their 200th birthday, notably schools like Baylor and Samford, each founded in the 1840s, and close behind are schools like Wheaton and Hope, founded in the 1860s. At these schools, and probably at every Christian college, there's a constituency of people who are passionately working to buck the historical trend. And at times, it feels a bit like their attempts are desperate, probably because they know that history is not in their favor. And so one option would be for us to just get in front of this and say, I think we know how the movie's going to end. Let's save ourselves the trouble and just embrace this inevitable trend toward secularism. I obviously don't think that's the right approach, because as much as I have become bothered by this goal of staying Christian, I'm not ready to throw it out. I actually think there's something buried underneath that goal that is still the most important and distinctive part of our identity. And so instead of dropping it, I've decided to start digging. And over the past couple of years, I've been trying to clear the rubble. I've had this hunch that underneath all the debris, there's still a firm foundation that we can build upon. And if we rediscover it, we might be able to reframe our Christian identity in a way that solves these three problems that I mentioned a moment ago. Redefining it so that it's one, clear and measurable, two, so that it feels naturally and organically related to the first goal of being the best college we can be. And 3, so that we're all aligned on what it actually means. I've been wrestling with this for a few years now, but over the summer, I think I've had something of a breakthrough. I think I may have found what I'm looking for. Now, admittedly, this has only been crystallizing for me recently. I've been dancing around these ideas for years, as I said, and it's only been within the last few months that some things have started to click. So it's probably a bit early for me to be going public with this, but then again, I think this is part of what being in a college community is all about, that we can share our ideas with each other even when they're still half-baked, and we can help each other refine them. And so this is a very rough, very preliminary proposal that I'm submitting to you for your feedback and for your refinement. And I'm asking you to interpret it charitably, but at the same time, I'm asking you to take it seriously and to push past any initial discomfort, any impulse you might have to dismiss it or to mock it. And with that, I guess I've delayed as long as possible, and I should just say it. So the big idea, my proposal for how we ought to think about our future vision is simply this. Instead of seeing ourselves as a Christian college, I think we should see ourselves as a college that follows Jesus. That's it. In other words, what if we stopped fretting about how Christian we are and started focusing on a new objective altogether, becoming a college that follows Jesus? In other words, what if we stopped asking questions like, how do we stay Christian, and instead started asking a whole new set of questions like, what if Jesus had a college? What would it look like? Could we become such a place? Now, I know when you hear that, there's going to be a number of questions, a number of reactions. And the main one is probably, wait, aren't those the same thing? Like, isn't this just semantics? And I'll come back to that in a second. In fact, I'm actually going to spend the majority of our remaining time trying to build an argument that no, it's not just semantics. These are actually two different things. But before we go there, I want to address another hurdle that some of you may be tripping over, which was actually a hurdle for me at first. And the obstacle is essentially the thought that, well, it just doesn't work that way. You can't just follow Jesus as a college. That's a little too cute, a little too simplistic. Because after all, what does Jesus have to do with education? I had those same doubts, but they completely vanished for me when I realized something that was hidden in plain sight. Jesus was an educator. He was a teacher. He was, of course, more than that, but not less. In fact, if you ask the question, what did Jesus do professionally? The answer is, he taught. Growing up, I had always heard that Jesus was a carpenter, but he wasn't. And it's weird that I missed that because it's actually something he makes a big show of emphasizing. It was Joseph who was a carpenter, and Jesus dutifully assisted Joseph with his carpentry until he began his own career. In Luke 2, there's this episode where Jesus, as a 12-year-old, leaves Mary and Joseph behind in the temple. And it's there that he announces to everyone that he's choosing a different career path, choosing to follow in the footsteps not of his adopted father, Joseph, but of his actual father. And so, at age 30, he chose a handful of students and began. And like me, you've probably heard them called disciples. But when I looked up that word, all the dictionaries said the same thing. The word disciple means student, pupil, or learner. The word disciple is simply the Latin word for student. And suddenly, with these discoveries, the idea of being a Christian college that follows Jesus didn't seem silly or superficial at all. Because a college teaches students, and Jesus taught students, which means following Jesus as a college simply means we do it his way. We follow his teaching pedagogy. And it was as I started to go down that road that things really started to get interesting. Because as I started to take a closer look at basic questions like, well, how did Jesus teach? And who did he teach? And why did he teach? I started to discover that these approaches were quite different than the typical approaches you see in Christian higher ed today. And the more I dug, the more convinced I became of something surprising. A Jesus college wouldn't just be slightly different than today's Christian colleges. In many ways, it would be the exact opposite. Let me say that again, because that's the main thesis I have this morning. I've come to believe that the approach Jesus takes to teaching, the pedagogy of Jesus, is the opposite approach that most Christian schools take. And what I'd like to do with the rest of our time this morning is not just tell you why I think that's the case. I want to show you. And I want to show you by leading you through the same thought experiment that I've been conducting for the past couple of months. There are 3 specific areas that I've found to be most eye-opening. 3 specific aspects of pedagogy where the Jesus approach and the Christian approach seem to be the most different. Who we teach, how we teach, and why we teach. It seems to me that who Jesus taught is the opposite of who most Christian colleges teach. It seems to me that how Jesus taught is the opposite of how most Christian colleges teach. And why Jesus taught seems to be the opposite of why most Christian colleges teach. And that's our outline for the rest of our time this morning. We'll look at each of those 3 in that order. And we'll start with who. Who do we teach? What's the makeup of the student body? Who do Christian colleges teach on the one hand, and who did Jesus teach on the other? And we'll start with Jesus. Most people in this room are probably familiar with how Jesus approached this issue because it was arguably the most controversial aspect of his career as an educator. And the simplest way of putting it might be to say that when it came to societal norms, Jesus liked to break them. He talked to people he wasn't supposed to talk to. He hung out with people he wasn't supposed to hang out with. He even touched people and let people touch him back in ways that were considered scandalous and highly inappropriate. And if it sounds like I'm describing a fallen leader, disgraced by scandal, that's because I am. His case was handled in roughly the same way it would be handled today with any leader who's accused of improprieties. Jesus was investigated by a special tribunal, he was found guilty, and he was sentenced. But instead of being merely asked to resign, he was executed, sentenced to death, in broad daylight, along the side of the road, naked. And the puzzling part is that he didn't do anything wrong or say anything wrong. He was just fond of hanging out with people who did. It was guilt by association, which means that if we want to be like Jesus, we better be guilty by association too. One mistaken assumption I held until recently was that Jesus' association with the wrong crowd was only a casual one. I had somehow gotten this idea that though he was graciously willing to talk to anyone or heal anyone or go to anyone's house for dinner, he wasn't actually close to any of these unsavory characters. But the record actually tells a different story. Jesus taught outsiders at every level of his curriculum. He had large lectures of thousands, medium-sized cohorts of 72, a senior seminar of 12, and a tutorial with 3. And at every one of these groups, he had people who didn't belong. It wasn't just the outermost circles to which he had the wrong sort of student admitted. It was to the innermost as well. Even for the 12, he chose students almost exclusively from backgrounds that would normally have been disqualified for study at that level with a rabbi, not to mention outright criminals and national traitors. And then there's the whole part about how when we say the 12, we really mean something more like the 15 to 20, because a few members of his senior seminar were so scandalous that their names had to be left off the class roster altogether. In that day, there was something even more culturally unacceptable than being a criminal or a traitor. It's being a woman. Luke is the only gospel writer who mentions that there were women there too, in the inner circle along with the 12. Unofficially, of course, because their presence in the class was illegal. Which is ironic because Luke also mentions something else. It was the women who paid most of the bills. Speaking of bills, we need to talk about how the bills are paid, and we'll come back to that subject in a moment. But for now, I think that wraps up the summary of how Jesus approached student selection. He taught a diverse group of outsiders who previously didn't have access to education, and he did so by removing barriers to entry. He was openly hostile toward the walls of separation that kept outsiders out and insiders in. He tore down walls of race, walls of gender, walls of religion, and walls of morality. That's his record. Whereas the record of most Christian colleges, at least historically, has been to actively fortify all of those walls. In the latter 2 categories, these walls along the lines of religion and morality, well, those walls are still standing strong today. Some Christian colleges still require students to sign a faith statement and adhere to codes of conduct where they commit to not engage in certain unchristian behaviors. And whatever the intent or justification may be, Those pieces of paper function as a wall, filtering out the wrong kind of student. Can you imagine Jesus himself requiring that students sign a statement and promise not to commit certain sins as a prerequisite for becoming one of his students? Other Christian colleges have less explicit walls. They may not make students sign a faith statement, but they remain pretty unfriendly places to students who come from different faith backgrounds or none at all. Here's the point. Most Christian colleges exclusively serve Christian insiders. But that's not the worst of it, because in addition to these religious and moral walls, other walls along the lines of race and gender were also quite common at Christian colleges until relatively recently. And in some cases, laws even had to be changed in order to force some schools to tear down those walls, these walls that excluded students on the basis of race. And yet some schools tore down those walls without fear, knowing a secret. It wouldn't really matter because there's more than one way to keep out the wrong sort of person. And all of this has helped me understand a dynamic that previously mystified me, a phenomenon I couldn't explain, which is why are Christian colleges, including ours, so much less diverse than our peer institutions? So for example, if you're comparing apples to apples, two schools that are very similar in the same geography, but one of them happens to be Christian, it's almost guaranteed that the Christian school will be more white. You probably know the numbers, but just to review, in the United States today, the college-age population splits right down the middle between white and non-white students. It's 50-50, which means that ideally, the demographics of enrolled students should match that. And in many places, it does, at least roughly. So for example, if you look at schools whose non-white population is roughly half, let's call it between 40 and 60% of overall enrollment, many of the schools that we would consider to be top public universities would be in that category, including places like University of Michigan and UVA, both of which are almost exactly 50-50. That category would also include many of the schools that we consider to be top liberal arts colleges, like a Williams or a Grinnell or a Middlebury. It would even include most of the liberal arts colleges in our region that we consider to be top schools, places like Kalamazoo or Lake Forest or Albion, all of which are between 40 and 50% non-white. But here's the problem. There's virtually no Christian colleges in that category. Almost all Christian colleges have non-white student populations of 40% or less, with very few exceptions. And here at Hope, our numbers are actually worse than most. Yes, we're making progress, and we should feel great about that. Our new incoming class is our most diverse ever, at 22% non-white. And I'm grateful for all the people who have worked tirelessly over the years to make this progress possible. But the fact remains that Hope is one of the least diverse colleges in the United States. Let me put it to you like this. There are 173 schools in the U.S. News National Liberal Arts Colleges category, which includes Hope. If you rank them by diversity, Hope is 146th out of 173, 15th percentile. If you compare us even to nearby Christian colleges like Wheaton, Aquinas, and Calvin, those schools all beat us by 8 to 10 percentage points. And I guess what I'm saying is there's no excuse for that. There's no legitimate explanation for it other than the obvious one, which is that for some reason, non-white students just don't want to come here. And we can say all day long, everyone belongs, but the numbers prove otherwise. And by the way, it's not just racial diversity where we should focus. Christian schools also struggle when it comes to socioeconomic diversity. As a sector, Christian schools are not just overserving white students, we're also overserving affluent students. At most Christian colleges, including Hope, more than half of the student body comes from families who would be in the top 20% of earners in the United States. That's half from the top 20%. And at Hope, about 60% of our students come from the top 20%, which means it leaves only 40% of our student body to represent the remaining 80% of income brackets. And please hear me, I'm not saying I don't want wealthy students. Jesus had wealthy students. But we must make sure that low and middle income families are not getting left out at the expense of wealthy students, because we need or want their revenue. To me, all of this is what Hope Forward is about. It's about us proving to students we want you here. And if you feel like you don't belong here or can't afford to pay, we want you all the more. It's not charity. We don't feel bad for you. We feel bad for ourselves because we're missing out on everything you have to contribute to our community. We're weaker without you. Jesus didn't get angry very often, which means I think it's worth paying special attention to the times when he does get angry. And in Mark 11, Jesus gets furious. He gets furious with the church because the so-called business of the church, which included things like selling animals to be used for sacrifices, had gotten in the way of their true business, which was to be a house of prayer for all nations. And with Hope Forward, we intend to make sure that our business model doesn't get in the way of the business that Jesus has called us to. And so we're aspiring to orient our financial model around the generosity of God, the ultimate giver of gifts. This spring, our first Hope Forward cohort will be graduating, which I'm pretty excited about. We started 3 years ago with 22 students, and now we're already up to 120. The first cohort is graduating. It's happening. And guess what? If you look at those 120 students, the students who are in Hope Forward are 52% white and 48% non-white. How about that? And it's just a matter of who rose to the top through the selection process. It's not because someone somewhere was trying to architect a certain demographic makeup of the group. Following Jesus means that Hope becomes a place where everybody from everywhere truly belongs here. And the less likely you are to think of yourself as a prospective Hope student, the more we care about you. Because there are 99 sheep applying to Hope. But there's one that's not applying, and that's the one that's most important. Do you know who else will be graduating this spring? Our first cohort of students in the prison education program. There are about 60 members of Hope's student body who won't be moving into the residence halls this week. And yet they're fully enrolled Hope College students. It's just that they happen to be living in the Scogin Correctional Facility. And this spring, 11 of those students will graduate with a full Hope College degree. When Jesus announced his mission during his first lecture, he quoted the prophet Isaiah and said, "I've come for the poor and the blind and the oppressed and the prisoner." You know that. You've always known that, just like I've always known that. But over the past year or so, ever since my trip to Haiti last summer, God has been showing me that I've never really cared about the poor and the marginalized. I thought I cared about the poor and the marginalized, but in reality, I did the religious thing. I studied the passages of Scripture where Jesus talks about the poor. I memorized them. I joined Bible studies and talked about them, and I treated that somehow like it was obedience. It would be like me telling my kids to clean their room, and when I discover they didn't clean their room and ask them why, they say, "Oh, well, what we did is we memorized your words. You said clean your room, so we memorized it. And we even learned how to say it in Greek and Hebrew. And then we formed study groups with our friends, and we talked about what it would look like if we cleaned our room. Isn't that enough?" And that's the game. That's the game I've been playing with God for most of my life. And now I'm going to try a new game. And the new game is kind of like Simon Says, which was this game kids used to play before there were phones and apps. And the game is simple. If Simon says it, you do it. And if he doesn't say it, you don't do it. And I want to try to do that with Jesus' words. If Jesus says it, I want to do it. Not study it, but do it. And I want to be part of a community that is wholeheartedly trying to do this with me. Because here's the thing. I've realized that I can't do this on my own. And that's something people will say to me sometimes as a criticism. Something along the lines of, "That's great that you want to follow Jesus, Matt, but maybe leave the college out of it. Follow Jesus in your private life." And it's only recently that I've realized how backwards that is. Because where is it going to be easier for me to follow Jesus' example of creating access to education for outsiders? Is it going to be easier for me to follow that example at home in my private life? Or is it going to be easier for me to follow that example in my work life, where I happen to be a college president? Following Jesus is something we have to do with our institutions and our professions and our industries, not just something we do in our private life with our free time and our extra money. And it's something we have to do together. And for that reason, I'm not asking us to re-examine hiring policies because we need committed followers of Jesus to work here and do the teaching. But I am asking us to think more inclusively about who we teach. because a college that truly follows Jesus would be radically inclusive. And the reality is that most schools who call themselves Christian are pretty exclusive. That's the first part. We're going to make a hard pivot to how. Number 2 is how we teach. And again, we'll start by looking at how Jesus teaches. So the question is, what's the teaching methodology that Jesus uses? And if I could summarize it, there are basically 2 primary techniques that Jesus used. The first was telling these riddles and stories, these parables that had deliberately obscured meanings, where the purpose is intentionally hidden. And the second way he taught was by asking questions, drawing the student out. Instead of telling them what to think, he led them on a journey to help them see for the first time what they've always thought, and then it was up to them to decide whether they wanted to keep those beliefs or change them. And in both of these cases, in the riddles and parables and in the questions, the one thing Jesus rarely ever does is offer direct answers. It's not that he didn't have definitive views on certain topics or that he wasn't willing to say one idea was wrong and another idea was right. Occasionally he would. And when he did, his students would rejoice because it meant they didn't have to work as hard. In John 16, there's this moment where his students say, "Finally, you're speaking clearly without using figures of speech." But those moments are rare. And the reason they're rare is that Jesus knew what all good teachers know and what all good therapists know, which is that the only answers that matter are the answers you arrive at yourself. If you've ever been to counseling, every once in a while, a therapist will break their own rule and tell you plainly, "Here's what I think you should do." Now, I love a good shortcut, so I appreciate those moments. Those are the moments when I feel like I'm finally getting my money's worth. But that's not really what I'm paying for, because these days answers are free. Just ask ChatGPT. You don't have to pay for answers anymore. The expensive part is being taken by the hand and led slowly and painstakingly on a journey of discovery. In other words, this distinction of whether you ask questions or provide answers has nothing to do with truth being relative or absolute. You can still believe in absolute truth, but refuse to give definitive answers. The reason for doing so is not because there are no definitive answers, but because announcing them at the outset is a hindrance, not a help. In other words, if teaching is a journey, and on day 1 you say, "We've arrived," well, that's not much of a journey. Jesus believed in absolute truth, but he also believed that it couldn't be contained in any statement. Instead, the truth he taught was himself. I am the truth. I am the way. And I don't think he was being difficult just for the sake of being difficult. I think if he had thought it would have been helpful to his students for him to write out the truth and clearly spell out what they should believe, I think he would have done so. The reason he didn't, I think, is because it was impossible. Because when Jesus says, "I am truth," what he's saying, at least in part, is that truth is living and active. And to try to capture it and put it on a page would be to freeze it in a certain position, like taxidermy. It won't ever move again. In other words, there's no way to freeze the truth without killing it. There's no way to capture it without draining it of life. The real truth can never be mastered. It's something that has to master you. Real truth isn't something you incorporate into your life as an add-on. It's rather something you incorporate your whole life into. And that's how Jesus teaches. What about Christian colleges? Well, here again, it's almost the exact opposite. Jesus teaches with questions, and Christian colleges seem to be places distinguished by extreme love of answers, by ideological commitments and doctrinal statements. And this seems to be especially the case today when it comes to hot-button social or theological or even political issues. At many places, the sentiment seems to be, sure, we'll talk about that. We'll put that question on the table. But before we do, before we consider all viewpoints, just so you know, here's a carefully worded statement that contains the answer. Here's the truth. And whatever those statements contain, or however true they are, they're only able to capture part of real truth, truth from a certain angle or perspective. If these statements could be phrased as questions instead of answers, I actually think a lot of good may come from them. But that's not usually the case. I know I'm speaking in generalities here. At the beginning, we talked about how the word Christian means different things to different people. And yet over the course of this talk, I've referred to Christian colleges as if they're all the same. And they're not. The term Christian college is a very broad one that includes many types of schools: Catholic schools, Protestant schools, church-related schools, Bible colleges, all of which are very different. But what they have in common is that most of them base their identity on a specific theological lens. That's how they differentiate. See, when you're differentiating, the all-important question is, as opposed to what? And most of us tend to think of Christian colleges as opposed to secular colleges. But for most Christian colleges, for most of their history, the decisive factor in their founding identity was not differentiation from secularism, but rather differentiation from other forms of Christianity. And the issue wasn't how do we stay Christian, but how do we stay Congregationalist, or Baptist, or Catholic, or RCA, or CRC, or SBC, or PCUSA, or UMC, or whatever the case may be. And that's basically how it's always been in Christian higher ed. It's commonly understood, for example, that Harvard began as a Christian college. I think it would be more precise to say that Harvard began as a Puritan college. And in their early days, there was absolutely no room for dissent from the Puritan theological interpretation. When Harvard's second president, Henry Dunster, openly questioned the practice of infant baptism, he was forced to resign. And if you see these schools for what they really are, denominational schools, it offers perhaps a new way of looking at their history. Because 200 years after Harvard's founding, Puritanism, which was once the dominant expression of Christianity in the United States, had essentially died. Thus, one way of looking at their history is to say it wasn't necessarily the case that they left the faith. Rather, it was the case that their faith left them. Here's the point of me saying all that. Most Christian colleges are actually denominational colleges that maintain a very narrow theological lens and ask everyone to agree on the answer before considering the question. And I just can't get over the absurdity of that approach. Because if the goal of higher ed is to learn new ways of looking at things, then what on earth could be the purpose of requiring everyone to look at things in the same way? What's the point of teaching those who already agree? This summer, I had the chance to go to Japan to visit our partner institutions there and meet with alumni in Japan. We also got the chance to go to a Japanese baseball game with some of the Hope students who were there on May term. It was so fun. But the highlight by far of the trip to Japan was the chance to visit the town of Komoro City. Komoro City is a town of about 40,000 people northwest of Tokyo. Komoro was the hometown of the first two Japanese students who studied at Hope. And their story is one I had heard before, perhaps you have too. But the story took on new meaning being there and meeting people in their community. In 1871, Hope's first president, Philip Phelps, was on a fundraising trip in New York City. And he ran into these two Japanese students who were college students, but they had run out of money. And so they were headed back to Japan. Phelps encouraged them to come home with him and finish their education at Hope. After all, Hope at the time was not charging tuition. The two students agreed. They came to Holland, lived with Phelps and his wife, finished their education at Hope, and then eventually did go back to Komoro City. But they went home different. Like most people in Japan, they were Buddhists when they arrived at Hope. And I don't know whether they still considered themselves Buddhists when they left. But what I do know is that they left as passionate followers of Jesus. And upon arriving back in Japan, one of them started a Christian primary school in Komoro City, and the other translated the New Testament into Japanese. And today, in that community, there are followers of Jesus who can trace the roots of their faith back to those two individuals. So that's the story, but let's rewind to the beginning, to the part where Phelps meets these students. And what he didn't say to them is, you can come to Hope, but before you begin your academic studies, here's all the answers to the big questions you'll be considering. What he didn't say to them is, you can come, but are you willing to put your current beliefs on a shelf? Instead, he just said, come home with me. Bring your culture and your beliefs and your assumptions and your worldviews along with you. Oh, and there's no tuition. So to sum up our point, I'm focused, man. To sum up our point about how Jesus teaches, Jesus leads with questions, whereas most Christian schools lead with answers. And before we move on, I want to point something out, which is something I said in the introduction. One of the things that this lens of following Jesus does for me is it helps me tie together a number of things that we've been talking about already. Because what I realized at some point, as I was thinking through these categories of who we teach and how we teach and why we teach, I realized that what I was seeing in the example of Jesus actually corresponded to some of the things we're already doing and talking about. So for example, in that last section, who we teach, discovering how Jesus approached student selection made me pretty glad that we've already started Hope Forward. Otherwise, I think we need to start something like that now. And it's the same with this one, this issue of how Jesus taught. Because again here, this is something I felt compelled to focus on for the last few years. This issue of preserving a space for dialogue in an age where free speech is rapidly disappearing altogether. Or put differently, the need for us to defend the middle way in an age when everyone is sprinting to the extremes. We're living through the most ideological, opinionated, angry time that anyone can remember. And people only seem to associate with others who share their beliefs. And what we're saying is, that's just not the way for a college to be. But it's deeper than that. It's not the way of Jesus either. All right. We've looked at who we teach and how we teach. 2 down, 1 to go. And I've saved the best for last, or maybe the worst for last, depending on how you look at it. Because as jarring as those differences are in the areas of who and how, I think the gap is even wider when it comes to this third aspect of Jesus' pedagogy, the issue of why he taught. And it was looking at this final aspect, the issue of driving motivation and ultimate outcomes, that convinced me more than anything else that a Jesus college and a Christian college are different. So let's first look at Jesus again. Why did Jesus teach? What was his purpose? Well, there's more than one way to answer that question, and I expect to be discovering new ones for the rest of my life. But there seems to be one driving motivation that is particularly hard to miss. You can see it when you look at what Jesus does after he teaches. And he always does the same thing. First he teaches, and then he sends his students out. And he does this with all of his students, from the outermost circles to the innermost. He tells the large crowds in the lecture hall, all right, now that you've heard this, you're the salt of the earth, you're the light of the world. He says to the mid-sized group of 72, you've been watching me and listening to me for long enough, now it's your turn. Go out there and don't come back until you've got stories to tell. And then the most famous of all are his final words to his senior seminar, his sending out of the 12. And what he says to them is go. Every time after teaching, Jesus says go. But go and do what? Well, go and bring light where there is darkness. Go and bring healing where there is sickness. Go and bring deliverance where there's oppression. Go and bring forgiveness where there's bondage. Go and bring freedom where there's Go and bring forgiveness where there's condemnation. Go and bring freedom where there is bondage. Go and bring life where there is death. In other words, there's a world out there that's all but given up. Go and bring hope. That's the why. That's the why of Jesus' teaching. His purpose was to transform his students into ambassadors of hope. And those of you who've been around me for the last few years know how fond I am of the word hope. I love that our college is named Hope. I love thinking about hope. I love talking about hope. I love spreading hope. Because as I've come to see it, hope is what following Jesus is all about. To be fair, it's also about faith and love. But of those three, hope is the one that's talked about the least, the one that is most often forgotten and overlooked. And I relish the task that our college has been given, which is to restore this forgotten value to its rightful place, to remind ourselves and everyone else of how beautiful and essential hope really is. And more than 5 years into taking on this assignment, I feel like I now have a better understanding than I used to of why hope, the virtue, matters, how it works, and what makes it possible. The key is, in order to have true hope, you have to be utterly convinced that the future will be better than the past. And that happens to be exactly the opposite of what seems to be one of the core tenets of Christianity in the United States, which is that the past is better than the future. And you might not have noticed, but once you start looking for it, you'll be shocked by how widespread it is. Christians as a whole seem to be people who believed that everything was better yesterday, which is why, instead of being characterized by hope, American Christianity seems to be characterized predominantly by fear. The future isn't something to look forward to, it's something we need to guard ourselves against. All the good stuff is in the past. The future is a threat. So we need to be afraid, We need to be anxious. We need to be constantly asking questions like, what if our best days are behind us? What if the thing we care most about is slipping through our fingers? How can we preserve, protect, and defend what our forefathers believed in? And all of that, sadly, is true of Christian colleges as well. When a college tries to stay Christian, or when a parent sends their student off to college, anxiously hoping that their child will stay Christian, there's no mistaking the fact that the basic orientation is toward the past. To the extent that preservation is the goal, then I suppose fear actually is the appropriate attitude, because as we talked about at the outset, the battle to stay Christian has historically been a losing one. And so if that's our goal, then we should be anxious, because in the back of our mind, we always know that the odds are against us. And so in response, we'll have to redouble our efforts and tighten our grip. But that just isn't how Jesus saw things. And it wasn't how he taught his students to see things. It wasn't the reason he taught. He didn't teach to preserve the past. He taught to create ambassadors who could bear witness to the coming future. And lest there be any confusion about this, that future is coming. That is a certainty. The war is almost over. The kingdom of God is at hand. And I know it may not look that way. But if you look outside at 4 a.m., it doesn't look like the sun is about to rise either, because it's always darkest before dawn. In other words, the reason we can be sure that the future is going to be better than the past isn't because we've got some plan to make it that way. It doesn't depend on us fighting to make it happen. Rather, it's going to happen because the sun always rises. It's going to happen because God is God, and we don't have to achieve or build or fight for this future. We just get to wait for it and watch for it and celebrate the signs of it as we see it arriving. And that's a key distinction that's pretty important toward understanding what it means to be an ambassador of hope. It doesn't mean that we have to fix all the world's problems. Jesus never asked us to do that. And a cynic might say, well, then what's the point? What's the point of fixing one problem if you can't fix all of them? What's the point of healing one disease if others will emerge? What's the point of healing one person if you can't heal everybody and that one person is still going to die in the end? The point is, it's supposed to be a teaser. It's supposed to be a preview of coming attractions, an appetizer. And a good appetizer doesn't fill you up, it actually makes you hungrier. It gives you a taste, and then you want more. And that's what we're supposed to be. We're the appetizer, we're the opening act, we're not the main event. Rather, like John the Baptist, our job is simply to warm up the crowd, to heighten anticipation, so that when the headliner comes on stage, everyone goes wild. And I will tell you, this headliner is worth going wild over. This headliner cannot be oversold because he's got eyes like fire and a voice like thunder, and he wears this white robe that's so bright you can barely look at it. And he's unbearably and inexpressibly and overwhelmingly beautiful. He was once dead, but now he's alive, and he holds the keys of death in his hand. And when he gets here, he's going to make everything new. And I realize that some of you sitting there aren't quite as sure about all of that as I am. And some of you may even pity me, saying that sounds an awful lot like wishful thinking. Like I'm still waiting around for a superhero to show up while the world goes to hell in a handbasket. And that's fine. I get that some of you see it that way. And if you do, then hope is just going to set you up for disappointment. So radical cynicism is actually probably the wisest approach. And the funny thing about that is that this seems to be one of the very few things that Christian colleges and secular colleges and those on the far right and the far left all seem to agree upon. They seem to agree that it's up to us to architect a vision for the future and fight for it. And if we don't, everything will turn out terribly. And the way I see it, that just isn't what this college is all about. That isn't why we teach, to create soldiers or cynics or saviors. We teach for the same reason Jesus taught, to create ambassadors of hope, who will themselves create ambassadors of hope, taking our place in an unbroken chain that spans from the moment Jesus left to the moment he returns. And in saying all this, it might sound like I'm advocating for something new, but really this has been the big idea behind Hope College from the very beginning, to train ambassadors of hope and send them out into the world. Even the ideas about removing barriers to entry and not charging tuition are not new. When Malcolm Gladwell was here last year, he kept asking the same question in different ways. Why did the revolution start here at Hope College? Perhaps the answer is a simple one. because we're willing to follow the original revolutionary, Jesus. And maybe that helps explain why there is so much about this place that's unique. After all, we are a place that didn't charge tuition for 54 years so that a Hope education could be available to all. We're a place that allowed Buddhist students to come in 1871 when other Christian colleges made students sign a doctrinal statement as a precondition for attendance. We're a place that admitted women in 1878 when only 10% of colleges did so. We're a place that today serves students from nearly every Christian background imaginable, Catholic, Protestant, and even Orthodox, while most Christian colleges continue to only serve a portion of those traditions. And perhaps most importantly of all, we're a place called Hope, named by our founders out of this driving conviction that we exist to bring hope to the world. And you know what? Do you know what inspired them to give us that name? It was Jesus. Specifically, Jesus' last lecture. I like to call it his last lecture. The name you're probably familiar with is the Great Commission. That's the name Christianity has given it. And that's not false, because it was great, and it was a commission. But I like calling it his last lecture, because it makes the moment feel closer and easier to understand. Last lectures are still a thing today. It's this beautiful moment where every student is listening because the professor has one more thing to say. So what did Jesus say in his last lecture to his senior seminar? Most translations render his first line as, "Go and make disciples." But again, what's a disciple? It's a student. So what he's saying is, go and get your own students. For the last few years, I've been your teacher, but now I'm leaving, class dismissed. It's time for you to go and find students of your own. And don't just go looking for them in the usual places. Do what I did. Find a group of students that no one would have expected. And don't teach them about religion. Teach them the same stuff I taught you. Teach them how to bear witness to the coming kingdom and the coming king. And then, when you've taught them everything you know, send them out to get their own group of students, the same as I'm sending you out. And the way I see it, that's all we're doing here. On our best days, we're doing nothing more and nothing less and nothing else than that. And as I said, it isn't a new concept for us. But as we enter this season of strategic planning and goal setting, let's ask ourselves, what would it look like if Jesus had a college? And can we be that place? And maybe there are some things we need to let go of in order to wholeheartedly be a college that follows Jesus. Maybe it's time to reassess some things we previously considered assets. Maybe it's time to forget some of what is behind and look forward to what is ahead as we press on toward the goal to win the prize. Because the prize hasn't changed. The prize was never being right or truth or righteousness or enlightenment or progress or tradition or staying Christian. The prize is a treasure, so valuable that it's worth giving up everything we have to find it. And once it's found, it's worth selling all we have to keep it. We were created to know and be known by God, but we've lost our way, and the only way back is Jesus. And the way of Jesus is not the usual way. And so as a college, I don't think ours should be either. Thanks.